The auctioneer in Cradle Bend, in the Arizona Territory, in the dry autumn of 1886, struck the gavel on a thing no man in the yard wanted, and the thing was a hole in the ground. $4. A dead well on a quarter section of Kalish Scrub, 2 miles east of town, sold with the rusted head frame still standing over it, and the rotted windlass still wound with a rope that had not lifted water in 9 years. The men laughed when the young woman raised her hand. They laughed harder when she counted the coins into the clerk's palm, $4 exact, and asked for the deed to be written in her own name. She did not laugh with them. She folded the deed once, put it inside her coat against her ribs, and walked out to look at what she had bought. Her name was Ada Coyle, and she was 28 years old, and 3 weeks before that gavel fell she had been turned out of her uncle's house in Tucson with a carpet bag, a leather satchel of her father's tools, and the clothes she stood in. What the men in the yard could not have known, watching her count those coins, was that Ada had spent 11 years at her father's side learning to read the ground the way other people read a printed page. They saw a woman who had bought a dry hole. They did not see what she had already seen in the 1 hour she had been allowed to walk that quarter section before the sale. Stay with this one. What waited at the bottom of that well had been waiting there longer than the laughter, and it would outlast every man who laughed. Her father had been a well man. Tobias Coyle had spent his working life lowering himself into the dark on a rope in Nevada and in Colorado, and at last in the Arizona Territory, finding water where ranchers swore there was none and mending the wells that other men had ruined. He had taught Ada the trade from the time she could hold a plumb line. He taught her that water has a smell before it has a sound, and a sound before it has a shine. He taught her to read the stain on an old casing, to know dry rot from wet rot by the give of the wood under a thumbnail, to listen to a dropped stone and count the silence, and know to the foot how deep a shaft ran. He had died of a fever 2 winters past, and his brother in Tucson had taken Ada in only long enough to decide she ate too much and spoke too plainly, and then had put her out. So she came to the well with her father's voice in her hands. The head frame was a 4-legged timber tower gone silver gray with weather, leaning a few degrees off true, and the windlass drum was wrapped in 80 feet of hemp rope, so dry it shed dust when she touched it. She knelt at the stone collar of the shaft, and put her face to the dark, and breathed. The men in town had told her the well was dead, drilled dry by the old Marsh outfit, and abandoned when the cattle company folded, fit only for throwing dead dogs down. Ada smelled what they had not bothered to smell. Down in that dark, faint, and cold and unmistakable, there was the breath of standing water. She did not trust the smell alone. She found a stone the size of a hen's egg, and dropped it through the collar, and counted. The fall was long, and the sound at the bottom was not the dry crack of rock on rock. It was a swallow. A soft, deep, closing sound. Water. She sat back on her heels in the failing light, and let herself understand what it meant. That a well the whole county called dry-held water at its foot, and that no one had gone down to learn why a well that held water had been sealed and called dead. A man does not abandon water in a country dying of thirst, unless the water was not the reason the well was dug. That first night she slept in the lee of the head frame with her satchel under her head and her coat buttoned to the throat against the desert cold, and she lay awake a long time listening to the wind move through the timber of the old tower and thinking about the swallow the stone had made. In the morning she walked the 2 miles back to Cradle Bend to buy rope. The mercantile was kept by a man named Eli Stroud, broad and slow and missing the last 2 fingers of his left hand, and he weighed her with a long look before he spoke. He told her plainly that she had been cheated, that the Marsh well had killed a man going down it years back, and no one had used it since, and that a dry hole was a dry hole no matter what a girl wanted it to be. He said it not unkindly, the way a man states a hard fact, to spare someone a harder one. Ada laid her coins on the counter and asked for 100 feet of new manila rope, an oak bucket, and a lantern, with a long wick and a tin of oil to feed it. Eli stood looking at her a moment, and then his eye fell to the tools in her open satchel, the plumb line wound on its wooden reel, the casing hook, the short crowbar worn bright at the working end, from years of use by a hand that was not hers. Something in his face changed when he saw the crowbar. He looked at it the way a man looks at a face he half remembers. He asked her, more quietly, whose tools those were. He told him they had been her father's, that her father had been a well man, and that she meant to work the well herself. Eli was silent for a while. Then he gave her the rope at cost, and the oil for nothing, and he did not tell her why. Not that day. What she did not yet know was that Eli Stroud had been the man who carried the body up out of that well 9 years before, and that he had spent every one of those 9 years trying not to think about what he had seen tangled in the rope when he did. Ada spent 4 days rigging the well before she went down it. She would not trust the old head frame, leaning as it was and gray with rot, so she felled a straight young juniper on the property line and limbed it and dragged it back behind a borrowed mule, a tall, patient animal with one white sock that she paid Eli a day's labor to lend her. She set the juniper as a gin pole, butted into a hole, she dug and tamped, raked back at the angle her father had shown her, and she lashed and braced it with guy lines run to 3 dead men buried in the caliche, and she tested it with her own full weight swung against it again and again until it did not so much as creak. She mounted a new pulley, greased it, spun it, listened to it, run true. She spliced her new manila to a sound length of the old rope, eye-spliced, and whipped the ends so nothing could fray and run, and she built a sitting loop her father had taught her, a boatswain's seat tied so it would bear her weight without ever tightening and cutting. Then she checked the air, because that was the part her father had been most fierce about. A flame that drowns in a shaft, he had told her, means the air below will drown a person the same way, only slower and with no warning. She lowered a stub of burning candle on a thin cord, a foot a minute, and she lay at the collar with her cheek on the cold stone, and watched the small flame go down, and it burned clean and yellow all the way to the water, and burned clean coming up. The air was good, she had done everything in its order, the way she had been taught, and the well, she thought, had stopped fighting her. The well wanted her to come. On the 5th morning she went down. She had tied her hair back hard and wrapped her hands in strips of canvas against the rope, and she had checked the gin pole and the pulley and the splice one last time in the gray before sunup, because her father had told her that the man who checks his rig twice goes down a 3rd time, and the man who checks it once does not. She lowered herself hand over hand, bracing her boots against the old casing, paying the rope through the loop a foot at a time, and she counted the courses of stone as she dropped through them, and the daylight overhead shrank to a coin and then to a star. The cold came up to meet her. It was the still cold of a place the sun had never reached, and it carried the smell of wet stone and old iron, and under it, growing, the breath of the water. The walls changed as she went, and she made herself stop and read them. The upper 40 feet were dry-laid stone, the work of the Marsh outfit, competent and plain, the joints packed with the kind of haste that means a crew was paid by the foot. She ran her wrapped hand along it and felt the carelessness in it. Then below the 40th course the stonework changed entirely, older and finer, the joints tighter than a knife blade would enter, the stone dressed and squared by a hand that had loved the work. She held the lantern close to the seam where the two met, and saw plainly where one well ended and another began. 2 wells, she understood, hanging there in the cold with the lantern hissing at her hip and the rope creaking once above her. A new well, dug straight down into an old one. Someone had found a far older shaft, a shaft dug with care and meant to last, and had built a careless dry hole on top of it for the single purpose of hiding that the older one was there at all. At 68 feet her boots touched water, and she stopped. and the small splash of it went up the shaft and came back to her changed. She hung above the black surface and held herself still until the rope stopped turning, and then she lowered the lantern on its cord until the light lay flat across the water. For a moment, she saw only her own face, looking back, dark and wavering. Then the surface stilled and the light went down through it, and the water was clear and very cold and perhaps 4 feet deep, and through it she could see the true bottom of the shaft. Stone, dressed stone, the same fine hand as the walls, and lying on that stone, canted a little to one side and half silted over with the slow drift of 9 years, was the unmistakable rectangular shape of an iron strong-box. She did not cry out, and there was no one to hear her if she had. She hung there in the cold and the dark with her heart going hard and her breath smoking in the lantern light, and she did the thing her father had drilled into her until it was deeper than fear. She looked. She made herself look at everything. She marked how the box lay, which corner was down, how deep the silt ran around it, where the casing was sound and where it bellied. She read the bottom of that, well, the way another woman might read a letter twice before answering it, and only when she had it all by heart did she let herself begin the long climb back up toward the star of daylight that meant the surface and the air and the work to come. She did not reach for it that first day. She had been taught that the ground gives nothing to the hand that grabs. She marked the depth on her rope with a twist of red thread, climbed back up into the hard autumn light, and sat a long time at the stone collar with her hands shaking, not from fear, but from the particular tiredness that comes after the body has done a thing. Then she did this sensible thing. She began, alone, to lower the water. It took her 9 days. She rigged a bailing bucket on the windlass, an oak pail bound in iron that Eli had sold her cheap, and she drew the water up 4 gallons at a time, hauling on the crank until her shoulders burned and her wrapped hands blistered through the canvas, and the blisters broke and healed into a working callus. She poured each bucket into a wooden trough she had built from the boards of the collapsed marsh bunkhouse, and the water ran off down the slope, and the scrub grew greener where it went, a thin green ribbon down the caliche that anyone could have seen and read for what it was if anyone had bothered. She kept count of the buckets the way her father counted everything. She knew to the gallon what she had lifted out of the ground. The first day she drew up 60 buckets, and the water at the bottom seemed not to have dropped at all. The second day she understood that the well was fed, that some small seam still leaked into it, and that she was not bailing a basin but fighting a slow spring, and a lesser worker would have quit there. She did not quit. She rose before light, and she bailed until the light failed, and she rested only when her arms would no longer close on the crank, and slowly, gallon by gallon, she gained on the spring. By the 4th day the level had dropped a foot. By the 7th it was down past her knees. The men who rode out from Cradle Bend to watch her work sat their horses at a distance and said among themselves that the girl was bailing a well dry to find nothing, and they were half right. She was bailing it dry. She came to know that well as she had never known any place. She knew which course of stone wept and which was sound, knew the sound the bucket made empty, and the sound it made full, knew the particular ache that came at the 40th bucket, and the worse one that came at the 80th. On the 9th day the shaft at its foot held only a skin of water over silt, and the strong box stood clear of it, dark and streaming, and Ada looked down at the thing she had emptied a well to reach, and felt the steadiness her father had promised would come to a person who did the work in its right order. Then she went down on the rope one more time to bring it up. It was heavier than it looked, and the bottom of it had rusted thin, and she would not risk hauling it whole and having the rusted iron give and spill its contents back into the dark. So she did the patient thing again. She passed a sling under it where it lay, 2 turns of rope cradled and cinched, and she raised it a foot at a time, steadying it against the casing with her own body each time the windlass paused, and when it came at last over the stone collar into the light it was streaming and red with rust and lock. Eli Stroud was there when it came up. He had ridden out that morning without quite telling himself why, and he stood at the collar with his maimed hand at his side and watched the box break the surface into the sun, and the color went out of his face. He knew the box. Ada saw that he knew it. She set it down on the flat stone and looked at him and did not ask, because her father had taught her that a man tells you more in the silence you leave him than in the answer you press him for. The lock was a good one, and badly rusted, the kind of lock a careful man buys, and rather than break the box and risk the contents, she worked it the way her father worked a frozen valve, with oil and patience and a thin pick filed down from a hat pin. She set the box on the flat stone by the collar, and she gave it 2 days. She wiped it down and oiled the lock and let the oil work, and oiled it again, turning the pick a hair at a time and feeling for the wards. And on the second evening, by lantern light with the wind moving over the scrub, something inside it shifted and gave with a small, dull sound, and the hasp came free in her hand. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the worst of the damp out, were 3 things: a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon, gone the color of weak tea; a small chamois sack, soft and heavy in the hand, that chinked when she lifted it; and a leather-bound book with a brass clasp, its pages swollen and warped but legible, a ledger kept in a careful sloping script that leaned all one way like grass in a steady wind. Ada opened the ledger first, because paper tells the truer story, and silver only tells you that someone wanted it. And by lantern light she began to read, and what she read rewrote the whole map of the country she had bought $4 of. The well, the old fine-dressed shaft beneath the Marsh outfit's dry hole, had been dug in 1861 by a man named Josiah Vane, and the ledger was his. Not a water well at all. Vane had struck a thin seam of silver in the side of an arroyo, and had sunk the shaft to follow it, and the chamois sack held what he had taken out, raw silver run into rough buttons, worth more than the $4 Ada had paid by a factor she did not at first let herself calculate. The silver was the smallest part of it. The papers were deeds and assay records and signed agreements, and the ledger told in Vane's own careful hand why a man would seal his own strike at the bottom of a flooded shaft and never come back for it. Josiah Vane had not owned the land alone. He had taken it up in partnership with the families who already worked the bottomland along the creek, a dozen households of small farmers and herders, Mexican and Anglo, and 1 black family, freed and come west after the war, and the agreements in the box were the proof of it, each one signed or marked and witnessed, each one promising a share of whatever the ground gave up, and the ground had given up silver. The ledger recorded the strike and the shares owed, and then it recorded what happened next, which was that a cattle company called Marsh and Holloway had come into the valley and wanted the water and the grass, and a man named Royce Holloway had wanted the silver and the land both, and had set about getting them the way such men do. Through the county clerk and the territorial recorder and a stack of paper that turned a dozen families' marks into nothing, Vane had seen it coming. The last entries in the ledger were dated in the spring of 1863, and they were not the entries of a defeated man but of a careful one, a man setting his affairs in order against a danger he could name. He wrote that he would not let the proof be burned, because he had seen Holloway's men burn a homesteader's deeds in a stove, and call the land unclaimed. He wrote that he had sealed the box and the silver and every signed agreement at the bottom of the shaft, below the water line where fire could not reach and where Holloway's men would never think to dig, that he had himself broken the old well's seep open to flood the works and had let the country call the shaft dry. He wrote that he meant to bring it all up again when the territory had courts that would hear a poor man against a rich one, and that if he did not live to do it, he trusted that water keeps what is given to it. Then the ledger ended, the last page half filled and the rest blank. Ada learned later from Eli that Josiah Vane had died that summer of a fall from a horse that 3 men swore was an accident, and that Eli had never once believed was one. Ada sat with the open ledger a long while in the cold, and the lantern burned down, and she understood that she was holding the undoing of the largest landholding in the county. Because Marsh and Holloway had folded, but the land had not gone to the families it was stolen from. It had gone parcel by parcel to the bank in Cradle Bend, and the bank was held by a man named Calvin Holloway, who was Royce Holloway's son, and who sat now in a stone-fronted office on the main street and held the notes on half the valley, and was reckoned the most respectable man in the territory. The dry hole Ada had bought for $4 held the paper that proved his father a thief and his fortune a theft. She did not ride into town and accuse him. She had been taught better than that, and besides, an accusation is only noise, and noise is the thing powerful men know best how to answer. She did the slow thing, the sure thing. She went to Eli Stroud, who had carried Vane's body and then 9 years later watched the box come up, and she sat with him in the back of the closed mercantile with a single lamp between them, and she asked him what he knew. For a while he said nothing, turning his coffee cup with his good hand. Then it came out of him the way water comes out of ground that has held it too long, slow at first and then all at once. He had been a young hand for Marsh and Holloway, 19 years old, and glad of the wage. He had been sent down the well after Vane was killed, sent by Royce Holloway himself to find whatever Vane was known to have hidden, and he had gone down in the dark on a bad rope with a guttering lantern, and he had found nothing because Vane had hidden it below the water, and Eli, half drowned and shaking with cold and fear, had felt nothing under his boots but silt, and had come up empty. He had lost the last 2 fingers of his left hand to the rope fouling in the windlass on the way up, and he had nearly died of it, and lying in his fever he had decided to tell Holloway that the shaft was bare, partly because it was the truth as he knew it, and partly because some part of him did not want that man to have whatever the dead man had died protecting. He had carried that for 9 years. The belief that he had been too weak and too frightened to find what was there, that he had failed Josiah Vane in the dark. He wept a little when Ada told him the box had been there all along below where he had reached, that no man could have found it without first emptying the well, that his failure had in fact been the thing that kept the proof safe until a hand came that would do the work in its right order. He wiped his face with his maimed hand and sat a while looking at the lamp. Then he said plainly that he would tell what he knew to anyone who would hear it, a judge, or God, or the whole of Cradle Bend, and that he should have said it years ago, and was ashamed it had taken a girl with a borrowed mule to give him the chance. Have you ever held a thing the world insisted was worthless, and felt the weight of it tell you otherwise? Ada had felt it twice now, once with her father's tools and once with this box, and she carried that feeling with her when she began, methodically, to find the families. It took her the whole of the winter. The agreements in the box carried names, a dozen of them, signed or marked and witnessed in 1861, and she followed the names the way she followed a water seam, patient and lateral, asking in the small places where poor people remembered other poor people. She rode the borrowed mule along the creek bottom in the short, cold days, and put up at night in barns and lean-tos and once in the back room of a church, and she learned to ask her questions sideways, never announcing what she carried, only asking whether anyone recalled the old families who had farmed the bend before the cattle company came. Some of the families had scattered to the 4 corners of the territory and beyond. Some had died out, their lines ended in a bad winter or a fever year, their names gone off the land entirely. Many remained, working other men's land, now along the same creek their grandfathers had been promised a share of, and Ada went to each one with the relevant page, and she did not make a speech, and she did not promise them riches. She showed them the mark or the signature, and she asked if they knew the hand, and watched old people touch the paper as if it might be warm. There was an old man named Tomas Reyes who kept goats on a rented hillside, whose father had marked Vane's agreement with a careful cross because he could not write his name, and who looked at that cross for a long time before he said that yes, that was his father's mark. He had seen it on the baptism record and nowhere else in all his life. There was a widow named Sarah Pence, who had been told the story as a girl, and had stopped believing it, the way a person stops believing in a thing that has only ever brought disappointment, and who sat down hard in a kitchen chair when Ada laid the page before her and did not speak for the space of a long minute. Each of them, in their turn, told Ada some piece of what they remembered, and the pieces fit together with the ledger like stones dressed by the same hand, and the shape they made was the shape of a theft so large and so old that the country had simply learned to live inside it as inside weather. One of them was a woman named Prudence Gaines, granddaughter of the freed man who had signed Vane's agreement with a firm, clear signature, a man who had learned his letters in secret before the war, and was proud enough of them to sign rather than mark. Prudence kept a small holding at the Creek's Bend and had been told all her life that her grandfather had been promised land and cheated of it, and that nothing could be done, because the men who did it were the men who ran the courts. When Ada laid the signed agreement on her table, in the lamplight of a January evening with the wind working at the chinking, Prudence looked at her grandfather's name in her grandfather's hand, the only thing of his she had ever seen written, and she put her work-worn finger on it and held it there, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, her voice quiet but firm, that she had not known he could write so fine. It was the plainest thing anyone said to Ada in all that long winter, and it was the thing that told her she had not bought a dry hole at all. The reckoning, when it came, did not come as a confrontation. Ada never once stood in Calvin Holloway's stone-fronted office and named his father a thief. She did the thing the ledger had waited 23 years for someone to do. She wrapped the box and its contents in oilcloth and clean flour sacking, and she rode 2 days north to the county seat, the borrowed mule and a second she had hired, and she laid the whole of it before a circuit judge named Whitfield, who held court 3 weeks in the year in a plank building behind the land office, and who had no connection to the Holloway bank and no reason to love it. She had written out, in her own plain hand through the long winter, an index of the papers. Each agreement matched to the ledger entry that named it, so that a busy man could find his way through the proof without her standing over him. She brought Eli Strout, who stood with his hat in his good hand and swore to what he had been sent to do and what he had failed to find, and who did not spare himself in the telling. She brought Prudence Gaines and Thomas Reyes, and the widow Pence, and one more heir of the signing families, who swore each to the hand on their family's agreement, the marks and the signatures they had touched in lamplight and known. And she brought the ledger itself, Josiah Vane's own careful account, dated and detailed and undeniable, recovered from below the water line of a well that the Holloways themselves had sealed and called dry. Physical evidence asks no favors and tells no lies. The signed agreements, the assay records, the dated ledger, the silver itself as proof the strike had been real, made a case that no amount of respectable standing could talk past. The court did not need Calvin Holloway to confess, and he never did. He sent a lawyer up from the territorial capital, a smooth and unhurried man in a good coat, and the lawyer argued the long years and the deaths of the witnesses and the difficulty of proving old marks made by men long in the ground. Judge Whitfield listened to all of it with his hands folded. Then he set the lawyer's arguments on one side and Vane's ledger on the other, and he found the ledger heavier. The old agreements were ruled valid. The conveyances by which Royce Holloway had turned a dozen families' marks into nothing were ruled the fraud they were. The land along the creek, parcel by parcel, was ordered restored to the heirs of the families who had signed, and the order was entered and dated and made final, and there was no gun drawn in any of it and no voice raised above the level of a man reading aloud. Calvin Holloway did not fight it long. A man whose fortune rests on a buried lie does not do well when the lie is dug up and read aloud in a courtroom, and the other men of standing in the county who had borrowed from his bank and tipped their hats to him on the boardwalk began to find reasons to be elsewhere when he passed and then to settle their notes early. and then to take their accounts to the new bank that opened 2 doors down. Within the year, he had sold what remained to him and gone east to a city where his name meant nothing and could therefore mean whatever he chose. And the stone-fronted office on the main street changed hands, and the valley went on without him, as a valley goes on without a stone pulled from a wall. He was not punished, he was simply made unnecessary, and then absent, undone by the weight of a thing his own father had tried to drown. Ada kept none of the land for herself, though the court would have granted her a finder's share and more. She took only what was hers by the plain law of it, the quarter section she had bought for $4, the dead well that was not dead, the head frame, and the gin pole she had raised with her own hands. The silver in the chamois sack she divided among the signing families along with their land. Counting it out in the same patient way, she had counted $4 into the clerk's palm, and she kept back only enough to buy good rope and a second mule and the few tools her father's satchel still lacked. Prudence Gaines tried to press more on her, and Ada would not take it, and the two women settled the argument the way frontier women settle things, with the matter dropped and a standing understanding that Ada's plate was set at the Gaines table whenever she rode that way. The men who had laughed in the auction yard did not, on the whole, apologize, because men of that kind seldom do. They did stop laughing. Eli Stroud, who was not too proud to say a thing plainly, told her in the Mercantile one spring morning that he had been wrong to call the well dead, and wrong to think a girl could not work it, and that he was glad to have lived long enough to be proved wrong in both. Ada told him he had not been wrong about the well being dangerous, only about who could be trusted to face the danger. It was as close as either of them came to a speech, and it was enough. She did not become rich, and she did not want to. What she became was the well woman of that country, as her father had been the well man of another. The valley remembered now that the dry hole east of Cradle Bend had given back to a dozen families the land that had been stolen from their grandfathers, and so when a rancher's well failed or a homestead came up dry, they sent for the coil woman, and she came with her gin pole and her good rope and her father's tools. And she went down into the dark where other people would not go, and she read the ground the way he had taught her to read it. She mended more wells than she could count in the years that followed. She found water under a hill where 2 drillers had sworn there was none, simply by reading the lean of the brush, and the color of the soil in a cut bank, and the family that had nearly walked off that land stayed on it because of her. She went down a shaft after a child's lost dog once and brought it up alive in her satchel, and would not take pay for it. She trained 2 young people of the signing families in the trade, Prudence Gaines's nephew and the widow Pence's granddaughter, a boy and a girl who came to her serious and stayed, because a skill kept to one pair of hands dies with those hands, and her father had not taught her so that the teaching would stop. She drilled them in the order of the work, the way she had been drilled, the air before the descent, the rig checked twice, the reading before the reaching. She taught them that water has a smell before it has a sound, and a sound before it has a shine. And she watched them learn to drop a stone and count the silence. And she knew that when she was gone, the country would still have hands that could read the dark. Years later, an old woman herself, she would take visitors out to the quarter section east of town and show them the well restored now, and giving sweet water, the head frame rebuilt true, and the windlass turning easy. She would let down a stone and have them count the silence, and when the soft swallow came up out of the dark, she would tell them how deep it ran to the foot, the way her father had taught her. And if they asked her what had been at the bottom, she would tell them the truth, which was that water keeps what is given to it, and that the things the powerful are most certain are worthless, are very often the things they have buried hardest. The last of her father's original tools, the short crowbar worn bright at the working end, hung on a peg by the door of the small stone house she built on that land, and it was the first thing her hand found in the dark when she rose, and the last thing she touched at night when she banked the fire. She had bought a hole in the ground for $4 while a yard full of men laughed. She had gone down into it alone. And what she had brought up had been waiting longer than the laughter, and had outlasted every man who laughed, and lay restored now in the hands it had always belonged to, along the green bend of a creek that ran at last through ground that was theirs. Do you think she should have taken more for herself, after all she did? Or was the keeping of so little its own kind of wealth? If a quiet story of a thing the world threw away turning out to hold the truth is the kind of story you keep coming back for, there are others like it waiting. Each one a different woman and a different thing the world was wrong about.